The year is 1837, and a young woman, barely 18, is about to ascend to the throne of Great Britain, ushering in an era that would bear her name, the Victorian Age. Yet, to truly understand the world Victoria inherited, we must first cast our gaze back a little further, to the landscape of Britain in the early decades of the 19th century, a realm caught between the lingering echoes of old traditions and the thunderous roar of a new industrial dawn. Imagine a nation still predominantly rural, where the rhythms of life were dictated by the seasons, and the village church spire often marked the highest point in the landscape. But beneath this seemingly placid surface, profound shifts were underway, tremors that would reshape society from its very foundations. The Napoleonic Wars, concluded just 2 decades prior at Waterloo, had left Britain victorious but weary, burdened by immense debt, and a populace grappling with the aftermath of prolonged conflict. Soldiers returning home found a scarcity of work, contributing to widespread discontent. The agricultural heartland, though still vital, was beginning to feel the pressure of an accelerating population and the nascent forces of industrialization. Enclosure acts, which had been consolidating common lands into private estates for centuries, continued apace, pushing many from their ancestral homes and into the burgeoning urban centers in search of livelihoods. These cities, like Manchester, Birmingham, and London itself, were swelling at an unprecedented rate, becoming crucibles of both innovation and profound social challenge. The political landscape was a complex tapestry woven from ancient privileges and emerging demands for reform. The British Parliament, though a beacon of constitutional monarchy compared to many European autocracies, was far from representative. The House of Lords, comprised of hereditary peers and bishops, held immense power, while the House of Commons, though elected, was dominated by a system rife with corruption and inequality. So-called rotten boroughs, constituencies with tiny populations, sometimes just a handful of voters, could elect members of Parliament, while vast industrial towns like Manchester or Birmingham had no direct representation at all. This glaring disparity fueled a growing clamor for political reform, a movement that gained significant momentum in the 1820s and early 1830s. The Whig and Tory parties, though not yet the distinct entities we recognize today, represented the primary political factions. The Tories, generally more conservative, drew their strength from the landed gentry and traditional institutions like the Church of England. They advocated for stability, order, and the preservation of the existing social hierarchy. The Whigs, on the other hand, were often associated with commercial interests, dissenting religious groups, and a more reform-minded agenda. It was a Whig government, led by Earl Grey, that finally pushed through the Great Reform Act of 1832, a landmark piece of legislation that, while not truly democratic, was a significant step towards broadening the franchise. This act abolished many rotten boroughs, redistributed seats to industrial towns, and extended voting rights to a larger segment of the middle class, though still excluding the vast majority of working men and all women. Historians still debate the true impact of the 1832 Reform Act. Some view it as a crucial turning point that averted revolution, while others see it as a limited concession designed to preserve the power of the elite. Beyond the halls of Parliament, the social fabric of Britain was undergoing a profound transformation, driven by the Industrial Revolution. This was not a sudden cataclysm, but a gradual, relentless process that had begun in the late 18th century, with innovations in textile production and steam power. Mills, factories, and mines became the new cathedrals of this age, drawing families from the countryside into lives governed by the relentless rhythm of machines. The conditions within these burgeoning industrial centers were often harsh. Workers, including women and young children, toiled for long hours in dangerous, unsanitary environments, earning meager wages that barely sustained them. The concept of a weekend or paid holiday was virtually unknown. Housing was overcrowded and squalid, leading to widespread disease and high mortality rates, particularly among the poor. Yet, amidst this hardship, a new class was emerging, the industrial capitalists and entrepreneurs, who amassed immense wealth from their factories and trade networks. This growing middle class, distinct from both the aristocracy and the working poor, began to assert its influence, not just economically, but culturally and politically. They championed values of self-reliance, hard work, and moral rectitude, principles that would come to define the Victorian ethos. This era also saw the rise of philanthropic movements and social reformers, often driven by religious conviction, who sought to alleviate the suffering of the poor and to address issues like child labor and public health. Figures like Robert Owen, a pioneering socialist, established model communities, while others campaigned for factory acts to regulate working conditions. The intellectual currents of the time were equally vibrant and often contradictory. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and individual liberty continued to influence political thought, while the burgeoning Romantic movement, with its focus on emotion, nature, and the sublime, offered a counterpoint to the rationality of the industrial age. Religious revivalism, particularly Methodism and evangelical Anglicanism, swept through parts of the population, emphasizing personal piety, moral conduct, and social responsibility. These religious movements played a significant role in shaping public opinion on issues such as slavery, which had been abolished in the British Empire in 1833, though the process of emancipation was gradual, and temperance. The monarchy itself, in the years leading up to Victoria's reign, had seen its prestige wane somewhat. George IV, who reigned from 1820 to 1830, was known for his extravagant lifestyle and unpopularity. His successor, William IV, Victoria's uncle, was a more unassuming figure, often dubbed the Sailor King due to his naval career. While well-intentioned, his reign was marked by political instability and a series of short-lived governments. The succession itself was a matter of considerable public interest and anxiety. William IV had no surviving legitimate children, making his niece, Alexandrina Victoria, the clear heir presumptive. Her youth and relative inexperience, coupled with the political and social turbulence of the era, meant that her ascension was viewed by many with a mixture of hope and apprehension. One lesser-known detail from this period is the widespread fear of revolution, particularly in the wake of the 1830 July Revolution in France, which saw the overthrow of Charles II. Many in the British establishment genuinely feared that similar unrest could erupt on their own shores, especially given the widespread poverty and the passionate demands for reform. This underlying anxiety shaped much of the political maneuvering and social policies of the time, influencing everything from police reform. The establishment of the Metropolitan Police in London in 1829 was partly a response to concerns about public order, to the cautious approach to electoral reform. The memory of the French Revolution, with its guillotines and radical shifts, was still fresh in the minds of the ruling class. So when the news reached the young Princess Victoria at Kensington Palace on that fateful morning of June 20th, 1837, that her uncle, King William IV, had died and she was now queen, she stepped into a kingdom grappling with immense internal pressures. It was a nation of stark contrasts: immense wealth alongside abject poverty, technological marvels alongside ancient superstitions, a powerful empire abroad, but a restless populace at home. The stage was set for a reign that would witness unprecedented change, a period of both immense progress and profound social struggle, all unfolding under the watchful, if initially inexperienced eye of its young sovereign. The challenges she faced were not merely personal, but systemic, rooted in the very fabric of a society undergoing a tumultuous, often painful metamorphosis. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution, the ongoing struggle for political representation, and the deeply entrenched class divisions were the immediate inheritance of the new queen. Her task would be to navigate these turbulent waters, to provide stability and leadership as Britain hurtled into an uncertain, yet undeniably transformative future. If you're enjoying this, liking and subscribing truly helps and is much appreciated. The rhythmic clatter of the power loom began to echo across the valleys and plains of Britain, a sound that would soon drown out the gentle hum of the spinning wheel and the quiet rhythm of the hand loom. This was the dawn of a new age, not heralded by trumpets or declarations of war, but by the relentless turning of gears and the billowing smoke from factory chimneys. The Industrial Revolution, a force more profound than any political upheaval, was reshaping the very fabric of human existence, pulling people from their ancient agrarian roots and thrusting them into a world of machinery, mass production, and unprecedented urban sprawl. For centuries, life had moved at the pace of the seasons, dictated by the sun and the soil. Families spun their own wool, wove their own cloth, and crafted their own tools, their lives intricately tied to the land they cultivated. But the innovations of the late 18th century, like James Watt's improved steam engine in the 1780s, began to unlock power on a scale previously unimaginable. No longer reliant on the capricious flow of rivers or the muscle of man and beast, factories could now be built anywhere coal could be delivered. This unleashed a torrent of invention, transforming industries from textiles to iron production. The textile industry, in particular, became the engine of this new revolution. Machines like the spinning jenny, the water frame, and the power loom, initially powered by water, then by steam, could produce cloth at a speed and volume that dwarfed the output of countless individual weavers. The consequences were immediate and profound. As factories sprang up, often in previously quiet rural areas or along rivers that could provide initial power, they became magnets for a burgeoning population. People, dispossessed from their land by agricultural enclosures or simply seeking a better life, flocked to these new industrial centers. They came from the countryside, leaving behind generations of tradition, drawn by the promise of regular wages, however meager. This migration led to an explosive growth in towns and cities. Manchester, once a modest market town, swelled into a bustling industrial metropolis, its skyline punctuated by hundreds of smoking chimneys. Birmingham became a hub of metalworking, its air thick with the clang of hammers and the smell of coal smoke. But this rapid urbanization was not without its shadows. The infrastructure of these burgeoning cities simply could not keep pace with the influx of people. Housing was hastily constructed, often in overcrowded tenements, lacking proper sanitation or ventilation. Whole families would cram into single rooms, sharing communal privies that overflowed into the streets. The air, once fresh and clean, became laden with soot and industrial pollutants, leading to widespread respiratory illnesses. Cholera and typhoid Diseases of poor sanitation swept through these densely packed communities with terrifying regularity. Life expectancy in these industrial centers plummeted, starkly contrasting with the healthier, if harder, lives of their rural counterparts. The factory itself, while a marvel of engineering, was often a harsh and unforgiving environment. Workdays stretched to 12, 14, or even 16 hours, 6 days a week, with little respite. The machines were relentless, their rhythms dictating the pace of human labor. There was no concept of overtime pay, sick leave, or holiday. Accidents were common, as workers, often exhausted and poorly trained, operated dangerous machinery without safety guards. Limbs were crushed, fingers severed, and lives lost in the relentless pursuit of production. Wages, while a step up from destitution for some, were often barely enough to survive, forcing entire families, including women and children, into the factories to make ends meet. The exploitation of child labor became one of the most glaring injustices of the era. Children as young as 5 or 6 were employed in factories and mines, their small hands and nimble fingers deemed ideal for reaching into intricate machinery or navigating narrow mine shafts. They worked the same long hours as adults, often for a fraction of the pay, enduring brutal conditions and severe discipline. Many suffered from stunted growth, deformities, and chronic illnesses due to the toxic environments and arduous labor. The image of the child sweep, climbing narrow, suffocating chimneys, or the young piecer in the textile mills, tying broken threads for endless hours, became a poignant symbol of the era's dark underbelly. While some argued that this provided children with a livelihood, the moral outrage grew, slowly building momentum for reform. This stark contrast between immense wealth and grinding poverty created deep social divisions. The factory owners, the industrialists, and the merchants amassed fortunes, building grand estates and establishing powerful dynasties. They were the new elite, their wealth derived from the sweat and toil of the working classes. Below them, a burgeoning middle class of managers, shopkeepers, and professionals began to emerge, benefiting from the new economic opportunities. But at the bottom of this new social hierarchy lay the vast majority, the industrial working class, or proletariat, living in conditions that shocked even some contemporary observers. This growing chasm fueled social unrest and the emergence of new ideologies. One of the most significant responses to these conditions was the rise of organized labor. Initially, workers' attempts to unionize were met with fierce resistance from employers and the state, which viewed them as conspiracies against trade. The Combination Acts, passed in 1799 and 1800, outlawed trade unions, forcing them underground. Yet, despite the legal prohibitions and harsh penalties, workers continued to form secret societies and friendly societies, pooling resources for mutual aid and, crucially, organizing strikes. These early strikes were often brutally suppressed, but they laid the groundwork for future movements. The Luddites, for instance, a group of textile workers in the early 19th century, famously protested against the introduction of new machinery by smashing it, believing it threatened their livelihoods. While their actions were condemned as violent and backward-looking, they highlighted the profound fear and desperation felt by those whose traditional way of life was being obliterated. As the Victorian era progressed, the voice of reform grew louder. Social reformers, philanthropists, and even some enlightened industrialists began to advocate for better conditions. Figures like Robert Owen, a Welsh textile manufacturer, experimented with utopian communities and improved working conditions in his new Lanark mills, demonstrating that profitability and humane treatment were not mutually exclusive. His efforts, though limited in scale, provided a powerful counter-narrative to the prevailing belief that harsh conditions were an unavoidable consequence of industrial progress. The political landscape also began to shift. The Great Reform Act of 1832, while not extending the vote to the working classes, did expand the franchise and redistribute parliamentary seats, giving greater representation to the booming industrial towns. This was a crucial step, signaling a recognition that political power needed to reflect the changing demographics of the nation. Following this, a series of factory acts were passed, beginning in the 1830s, slowly but surely regulating working hours, particularly for women and children. The Factory Act of 1833, for example, limited the working hours of children in textile mills and appointed inspectors to enforce the new laws, a landmark moment in state intervention in labor relations. However, enforcement was often weak, and many employers found ways to circumvent the regulations. The debate over the condition of England, as it was often called, became a central theme of Victorian thought and literature. Novelists like Charles Dickens, in works such as Hard Times and Oliver Twist, vividly depicted the squalor, poverty, and moral decay that industrialization wrought upon the urban poor. His stories, though fictional, resonated deeply with public consciousness, exposing the human cost of unchecked industrial growth. Social commentators like Thomas Carlyle and John Ruskin railed against the dehumanizing effects of the factory system and the pursuit of wealth above all else. This intellectual ferment, coupled with the persistent agitation of working-class movements like Chartism, kept the issues of social justice and economic inequality firmly on the national agenda. The Chartist movement, which emerged in the late 1830s, was perhaps the most significant working-class political movement of the era. They presented a people's charter, demanding universal male suffrage, annual parliaments, secret ballots, and other democratic reforms. While their petitions were repeatedly rejected by Parliament, and the movement ultimately faded by the 1850s, Chartism demonstrated the growing political consciousness of the working class and their determination to achieve greater political representation. Historians still debate the true impact of Chartism, whether it was a failure because its immediate demands were not met, or a long-term success because many of its proposals were eventually adopted decades later. Regardless, it undeniably forced the political establishment to confront the demands of the working population. The mid-Victorian period, often referred to as the Age of Equipoise, saw a period of relative stability and prosperity. The Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in the magnificent Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, was a dazzling display of Britain's industrial might and imperial power. It showcased the latest technological innovations, from steam engines to elaborate machinery, and celebrated the nation's position as the workshop of the world. For many, it symbolized the triumph of progress and the promise of a glorious future. Yet even amidst this celebratory atmosphere, the underlying social problems persisted, hidden beneath the glittering facade of prosperity. The exhibition itself, while a marvel, was built by workers who often lived in the very conditions it sought to overshadow. The expansion of the railway network, a truly transformative innovation, further accelerated the pace of change. By the 1840s and 50s, lines crisscrossed the country, connecting industrial centers to ports and markets, facilitating the rapid movement of goods and people. This not only boosted trade, but also began to break down regional isolation, bringing diverse communities into closer contact. The railway journey itself, once a slow and arduous undertaking by stagecoach, became faster, cheaper, and more accessible to the masses, subtly reshaping daily life and expanding horizons. The sheer scale of engineering required to build these networks, from tunnels to viaducts, was a testament to Victorian ingenuity and its boundless ambition. However, the very success of industrialization also created new challenges. The relentless pursuit of efficiency and profit led to a culture of intense competition. Britain's early lead in industrialization meant it faced little international competition for decades. But by the latter half of the century, other nations, particularly Germany and the United States, began to industrialize rapidly, adopting and improving upon British technologies. This emerging competition would later force Britain to reevaluate its industrial practices and invest more heavily in scientific research and technical education. The rise of the trade union movement, despite continued legal obstacles, gained strength in the latter half of the century. The repeal of the Combination Acts in 1824 and 1825 was a significant step, though unions still faced legal challenges and restrictions. The formation of the new model unions in the 1850s, such as the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, marked a shift towards more respectable, financially stable, and politically moderate organizations. These unions focused on skilled workers, offering benefits like sickness pay and unemployment insurance, thereby attracting a more stable membership. They engaged in collective bargaining, slowly winning concessions on wages and working conditions. The Trade Union Act of 1871 finally granted trade unions legal status, marking a pivotal moment in the recognition of workers' rights to organize. The Victorian era, therefore, was a period of immense paradox. It was an age of unparalleled progress and innovation, where human ingenuity seemed to know no bounds. Cities grew, machines roared, and wealth accumulated on a scale never before seen. Yet, it was also an age of profound social upheaval, marked by grinding poverty, brutal working conditions, and stark inequalities. The smoke from the factory chimneys, while a symbol of progress, also cast a long shadow over the lives of millions. The relentless march of industrialization transformed the landscape, the economy, and the very structure of society, leaving an indelible mark that continues to shape the world we inhabit today. The struggle between the forces of progress and the demands of social justice, born in the crucible of the Industrial Revolution, would continue to define the Victorian age and beyond, echoing through the corridors of power and the teeming streets of its rapidly expanding cities. The faint scent of coal smoke, carried on the Thames breeze, was a constant companion to the burgeoning heart of the British Empire. As the 19th century unfolded, the nation, already a formidable maritime power, began to truly embrace its imperial destiny, a destiny often painted in hues of duty, progress, and, undeniably, profit. The motivations were a complex tapestry: economic necessity, the relentless pursuit of raw materials for its factories and new markets for its finished goods, strategic imperatives, the desire to secure vital trade routes and prevent rival powers from gaining an advantage, and a pervasive sense of moral obligation, the belief in a civilizing mission to uplift what was perceived as less developed societies. This last, often termed the white man's burden, became a powerful, if ethically fraught, justification for expansion. One of the earliest and most pivotal territories in this grand expansion was India. The East India Company, initially a trading venture, had by the mid-18th century become a de facto ruler over vast swathes of the subcontinent. Its private army, composed largely of Indian sepoys under British officers, enforced its will, and its administrative structures extracted immense wealth. By 1857, simmering resentments over religious insensitivity, land policies, and perceived injustices erupted into the Sepoy Mutiny, a brutal and widespread rebellion that shook British rule to its core. The suppression of this uprising was swift and merciless, leading directly to the British Crown taking direct control of India in 1858, dissolving the East India Company. This marked the official beginning of the British Raj, an era that would profoundly shape both India and Britain. India became the jewel in the crown, a source of cotton, tea, spices, and a vast market for British manufactured goods. Its strategic importance was paramount, serving as a base for further expansion into Southeast Asia and a bulwark against Russian ambitions in Central Asia. The acquisition of Singapore in 1819 by Stanford Raffles, a visionary administrator, exemplified another facet of imperial ambition: the strategic port. Raffles recognized the island's immense potential as a trading hub at the crossroads of vital shipping lanes between India and China. Despite initial resistance from the Dutch, who claimed the region, Singapore quickly blossomed into a bustling free port, a testament to British mercantile acumen and its commitment to global trade. Its deep harbor and strategic location made it an indispensable link in the imperial chain, facilitating the flow of goods and people across the vast distances of the empire. Further south, the vast continent of Australia, initially a penal colony established in 1788, gradually transformed into a land of opportunity. The discovery of gold in the 1850s triggered a massive influx of immigrants, accelerating its development and shifting its identity from a distant outpost of punishment to a vibrant, self-governing dominion. Similarly, New Zealand, after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 with the Maori chiefs, became another key territory in the South Pacific, attracting British settlers seeking new lives and agricultural prospects. These settler colonies, with their temperate climates and perceived emptiness, often ignoring or downplaying the presence of indigenous populations, were seen as extensions of Britain itself, places where British culture and institutions could flourish. The scramble for Africa in the latter half of the 19th century marked a frenetic and often brutal phase of imperial expansion. Driven by the desire for raw materials like rubber, diamonds, and gold, and by geopolitical rivalries with other European powers, Britain carved out vast territories, including Egypt, Sudan, parts of West Africa, and a significant portion of southern Africa. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, became a crucial artery for imperial trade and military movements, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and shortening the route to India. Britain's acquisition of a controlling stake in the canal in 1875, thanks to Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli's shrewd financial maneuverings, solidified its strategic dominance in the region. The motivations behind this African land grab were not purely economic. There was also a strong element of national prestige, a belief that a nation's power was measured by the extent of its colonial possessions. Explorers like David Livingstone, though driven by a genuine desire to map the continent and combat the slave trade, inadvertently paved the way for colonial annexation. Missionaries, too, played a significant role, often preceding or accompanying colonial forces, spreading Christianity and Western education, which sometimes served as a tool for cultural assimilation. One lesser-known detail of this era of expansion is the role of the telegraph cable. As the empire grew, so too did the need for rapid communication across vast distances. The laying of undersea telegraph cables, beginning in the 1850s, revolutionized imperial administration. Messages that once took weeks or months by ship could now be transmitted in minutes. The All-Red Line, a proposed network of telegraph cables connecting all parts of the British Empire without touching foreign soil, became a powerful symbol of imperial unity and technological prowess, though it was never fully realized in its purest form. This technological marvel allowed London to exert tighter control over its distant possessions, coordinating military movements, trade policies, and administrative decisions with unprecedented speed. The relationship between imperial power and domestic identity was deeply intertwined. The empire became a source of immense national pride, fostering a sense of superiority and destiny among the British populace. Maps depicting vast swathes of the globe, colored in red, became ubiquitous, displayed in schools, homes, and public buildings, instilling a visual understanding of Britain's global reach. Imperial exhibitions, like the Great Exhibition of 1851, showcase the industrial might and technological advancements of Britain, often featuring exotic goods and peoples from the colonies, reinforcing the narrative of British dominance and the civilizing mission. However, this imperial embrace was not without its internal critics. While the majority of the population likely supported or were indifferent to the empire, voices of dissent did emerge. Figures like John Bright, a prominent liberal politician, argued against imperial expansion on moral and economic grounds, contending that it led to costly wars and diverted resources from domestic needs. Others, particularly in the nascent labor movement, questioned the benefits of empire for the working classes, suggesting that the wealth generated flowed primarily to the elites. Nevertheless, these dissenting voices remained largely on the periphery, overshadowed by the prevailing tide of imperial enthusiasm. The economic benefits of empire were undeniable, though perhaps not as universally distributed as popular narratives suggested. British industries thrived on the raw materials extracted from the colonies and the captive markets they provided. Cotton from India, rubber from Malaya, and minerals from Africa fueled the factories of Lancashire and the Midlands. The City of London became the financial capital of the world, financing global trade and investment, much of it tied to imperial ventures. This economic interconnectedness meant that the prosperity of many British families, directly or indirectly, became linked to the continued functioning of the empire. Yet, historians still disagree whether the empire was, on balance, a net economic gain for Britain as a whole, or if the costs of administration, defense, and military campaigns ultimately offset the profits. Some argue that the empire distorted Britain's economic development, leading to underinvestment in domestic industries and an over-reliance on colonial markets. Others contend that it provided a crucial competitive advantage, allowing Britain to maintain its industrial lead for longer than it otherwise might have. This debate often hinges on how one calculates the intangible costs and benefits, the human toll of colonial exploitation versus the intangible pride and strategic security. The cultural impact of empire on Britain was profound. Foods like tea, spices, and sugar, once luxuries, became staples of the British diet, transforming culinary habits. Words from Hindi, Malay, and other colonial languages entered the English lexicon. The influx of goods, ideas, and even people from the colonies subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, shaped British society. Museums filled with artifacts from distant lands educated and entertained, while popular literature, from adventure novels to children's stories, often romanticized or justified the imperial project, depicting courageous explorers and benevolent administrators bringing order to chaotic lands. The military, too, was inextricably linked to the empire. The Royal Navy, the largest and most powerful fleet in the world, was the ultimate guarantor of imperial security, protecting trade routes and projecting British power globally. The British Army, though smaller, maintained garrisons across the empire, suppressing rebellions and defending borders. Service in the imperial forces became a rite of passage for many young men, particularly from the upper and middle classes, offering opportunities for adventure, distinction, and social advancement. The experience of governing and fighting in distant lands undoubtedly shaped the character and worldview of a generation of British leaders and citizens. The concept of dominion status, granted to settler colonies like Canada 1867, Australia 1901, New Zealand 1907, and South Africa 1910, represented an evolution in imperial governance. These territories, with their predominantly European populations, were granted significant self-rule, managing their own internal affairs while remaining loyal to the crown and contributing to imperial defense. This move was partly pragmatic, recognizing the growing maturity and distinct identities of these colonies, and partly strategic, aiming to maintain their loyalty and cooperation within the broader imperial framework. It reflected a gradual shift from direct rule to a more decentralized, though still hierarchical system. As the Victorian era drew to a close, the British Empire stood at its zenith, a vast global network encompassing nearly a quarter of the world's landmass and population. Its reach was unprecedented, its influence undeniable. The sun, it was famously said, never set on the British Empire, a testament to its sheer geographical spread. This immense power, however, brought with it immense responsibilities and complex challenges. The very act of governing such diverse peoples and territories, often with differing customs, religions, and aspirations, created tensions that would eventually lead to the empire's unraveling in the 20th century. But for now, in the fading light of the 19th century, the empire seemed an immutable force, a testament to British ingenuity, ambition, and a pervasive belief in its own unique destiny. Perhaps these vast networks of trade, governance, and communication, stretching across oceans and continents, whispered stories of both triumph and subjugation to the stars, a complex legacy that continues to resonate in the modern world. The gentle hum of progress, once a distant melody, now vibrated through the very fabric of Victorian society, ushering in an era of unprecedented intellectual ferment. The mid-Victorian period, roughly from the 1850s to the 1870s, became a crucible where long-held beliefs were tested, challenged, and sometimes irrevocably transformed by the relentless march of scientific discovery. It was a time when the world seemed to shrink, not just through the speed of steam and telegraph, but through the expanding horizons of human understanding. One of the most profound tremors to shake this intellectual landscape arrived in 1859 with the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Imagine, if you will, the quiet rustle of pages in countless studies and drawing rooms as this revolutionary text began to circulate. Darwin, a naturalist of meticulous observation, had spent years pondering the variations he observed in species, particularly during his voyage aboard HMS Beagle. His theory, elegantly simple, yet staggeringly complex in its implications, proposed that all life on Earth shared a common ancestor and had diversified over vast stretches of time through a process he called natural selection. Organisms with traits best suited to their environment were more likely to survive and reproduce, passing those advantageous traits to their offspring. Over generations, these subtle shifts could lead to entirely new species. The impact of Darwinism was immediate and far-reaching, rippling through not just the scientific community, but also religious, philosophical, and social spheres. For centuries, the prevailing view of life's origins had been one of divine creation, often interpreted literally from biblical accounts. Darwin's theory, while not explicitly denying a creator, offered a mechanistic explanation for life's diversity that seemed to remove humanity from its unique, divinely appointed pedestal. The idea that humans, too, were part of this grand, evolving tapestry, sharing ancestry with other primates, was deeply unsettling to many. Debates raged in scientific societies, in the press, and even from pulpits. Thomas Henry Huxley, a fierce advocate for Darwin's ideas, earned the moniker Darwin's Bulldog for his spirited defense against critics, most famously during a public debate with Bishop Samuel Wilberforce in 1860 at the Oxford University Museum. This particular confrontation, though perhaps embellished in later retellings, symbolized the clash between emerging scientific thought and established religious dogma. Yet beyond the controversy, Darwin's work ignited a new fervor for biological research. Scientists began to look at the natural world with fresh eyes, seeking evidence for evolution in the fossil record, in embryology, and in comparative anatomy. Paleontology, the study of ancient life through fossils, gained immense importance as new discoveries unearthed creatures that seemed to bridge evolutionary gaps. The finding of Archaeopteryx in Germany in 1861, a creature with both reptilian and bird-like features, provided compelling support for the idea of transitional forms, further bolstering Darwin's arguments. But the intellectual ferment of the mid-Victorian era extended far beyond biology. Physics, too, was undergoing a quiet revolution, though its implications were perhaps less immediately disruptive to societal norms. James Clerk Maxwell, a brilliant Scottish mathematician and physicist, was meticulously weaving together the disparate threads of electricity, magnetism, and light. In the 1860s, he formulated his famous set of equations, now known as Maxwell's equations, which unified these forces into a single, elegant theory of electromagnetism. He demonstrated that light itself was an electromagnetic wave, propagating through space at a finite speed. This was a monumental leap in understanding, laying the theoretical groundwork for future technologies like radio and wireless communication, even if their practical applications were still decades away. Maxwell's work showcased the power of theoretical physics to predict phenomena that were not yet directly observable, a testament to the era's growing confidence in the scientific method. Alongside these grand scientific theories, a more subtle but equally significant intellectual movement was taking root. Positivism, championed by the French philosopher Auguste Comte, though it found fertile ground in Britain. Comte argued that human knowledge progressed through three stages: theological, metaphysical, and finally, the positive or scientific stage, where knowledge was based solely on observable phenomena and empirical evidence. This philosophy encouraged a rigorous, evidence-based approach to all forms of inquiry, including the study of society itself. Figures like John Stuart Mill, a towering intellectual of the era, while not a strict positivist, certainly embraced the empirical spirit, advocating for logical reasoning and evidence in his influential works on liberty and economics. The emphasis on observable facts and systematic investigation began to permeate various disciplines, fostering a more analytical and data-driven approach to understanding the world. The mid-Victorian period also saw the burgeoning of new academic disciplines. Anthropology, the systematic study of human societies and cultures, began to emerge as distinct from mere travelogue or natural history. Scholars like Edward Burnett Tylor, often considered one of the founders of modern anthropology, published works like Primitive Culture in 1871, attempting to understand the evolution of human civilization and the origins of religious belief through a comparative lens. He proposed the concept of survivals, cultural traits or beliefs that persist from earlier stages of human development, offering a framework for understanding seemingly irrational customs. This nascent field, while sometimes burdened by the evolutionary biases of the era, nonetheless represented a crucial step towards a more scientific understanding of humanity's diverse ways of life. However, the very success of scientific inquiry sometimes led to unexpected challenges. As science offered increasingly mechanistic explanations for the natural world, some intellectuals grappled with the implications for human free will and the meaning of life. If everything could be explained by natural laws, where did purpose and morality fit in? This intellectual tension gave rise to various philosophical responses, from renewed religious fervor to the emergence of agnosticism, a term coined by Thomas Henry Huxley himself, signifying a position of neither belief nor disbelief in God, but rather a recognition of the limits of human knowledge. Consider, too, the less heralded but equally vital advancements in public health and medicine during this period. While not always driven by grand theoretical breakthroughs, the application of scientific principles to practical problems yielded immense benefits. The work of figures like Florence Nightingale, who revolutionized nursing during the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, by emphasizing sanitation and hygiene, demonstrated the power of data-driven approaches to improve health outcomes. Her meticulous record-keeping and statistical analysis revealed the devastating impact of preventable diseases in military hospitals, leading to significant reforms. Similarly, John Snow's groundbreaking investigation into the Broad Street cholera outbreak in London in 1854, where he meticulously mapped cases and traced the source to a contaminated water pump, laid the foundation for modern epidemiology and public health interventions. These practical applications of scientific method, though perhaps less dramatic than Darwin's theories, saved countless lives and fundamentally altered urban living. The spirit of inquiry also extended to the very earth beneath their feet. Geology, a relatively young science, continued to mature, building upon the foundations laid by earlier pioneers like Charles Lyell. Geologists of the mid-Victorian era were meticulously mapping rock formations, studying fossils, and piecing together the Earth's ancient history. The realization that the Earth was far, far older than previously imagined, stretching back millions, even billions of years, was another profound shift in perspective. This vast geological timescale provided the necessary canvas for Darwin's theory of slow, gradual evolution to unfold. The discovery of ancient human remains and tools, like those found in Brixham Cave in 1858, further pushed back the timeline of human existence, challenging conventional notions of human origins and prompting intense archaeological investigation. Yet, despite the dazzling pace of discovery, some mysteries continued to elude complete understanding, sparking ongoing scholarly debate. For instance, while Darwin's theory of natural selection provided a powerful mechanism for evolution. The precise way in which traits were inherited remained a puzzle. Darwin himself proposed a theory of pangenesis, suggesting that particles called gemmules from all parts of the body were collected in the reproductive organs and passed on to offspring. This idea, however, was later disproven. It wouldn't be until the rediscovery of Gregor Mendel's work on genetics in the early 20th century that the true mechanisms of heredity would begin to be understood, leaving a significant gap in the evolutionary theory of the mid-Victorian era. Historians still debate how much this missing piece hindered the full acceptance and understanding of Darwinism at the time, or whether the sheer explanatory power of natural selection was enough to carry the theory forward. The intellectual ferment of the mid-Victorian period was not just about isolated discoveries. It was about a fundamental shift in how knowledge was acquired and validated. The scientific method, with its emphasis on observation, experimentation, and peer review, became the gold standard for truth-seeking. This era saw the rise of professional scientific societies, specialized journals, and university departments dedicated to scientific research, solidifying science's place as a powerful and respected institution. It was a time when the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, coupled with a belief in its potential to improve human life, became a driving force. Perhaps these intellectual currents, like unseen rivers, flowed beneath the surface of everyday Victorian life, shaping the very air they breathed. They fostered a sense of both wonder and unease, expanding the universe while simultaneously challenging humanity's perceived centrality within it. The world was becoming a place of laws and mechanisms, of deep time and slow change, a place where the old stories were being reread through the lens of empirical evidence. This profound intellectual transformation laid the groundwork for the scientific and technological marvels of the coming centuries, forever altering humanity's relationship with the natural world and with itself. The echoes of these Victorian debates, the questions they posed about origins, purpose, and knowledge, continue to resonate even today, a testament to the enduring power of inquiry. As the industrial gears turned ever faster, reshaping landscapes and lives, a parallel transformation was unfolding within the very heart of society: the home. The Victorian era, for all its outward dynamism and technological marvels, was also a period of profound introspection regarding morality, respectability, and the precise roles each individual was expected to play within the grand theater of life. The concept of domesticity became not merely a description of home life, but an almost sacred ideal, a fortress against the perceived chaos and moral decay of the burgeoning urban centers. For the burgeoning middle class, and indeed for those who aspired to join their ranks, the home was elevated to a sanctuary, a haven of peace and purity in a world increasingly characterized by grime, competition, and moral ambiguity. This ideal was meticulously constructed, brick by brick, through literature, sermons, and popular magazines, creating a pervasive cultural narrative that defined respectability. At its core lay the strict segregation of gender roles. The public sphere, the world of commerce, politics, and industry, was unequivocally the domain of men. It was a realm of fierce competition, moral compromise, and often physical danger. The home, by contrast, was the woman's empire, a private space where virtues like piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity were to be cultivated and cherished. This was the famous, or perhaps infamous, ideal of the angel in the house, a phrase coined by the poet Coventry Patmore in his 1854 narrative poem celebrating his wife, Emily. This angel was envisioned as a gentle, self-sacrificing creature devoted entirely to the comfort and moral upliftment of her husband and children. Her presence was believed to soothe the rough edges of the outside world, providing a moral compass for the family. This rigid division, however, was not without its complexities and contradictions. While the ideal woman was confined to the domestic sphere, her influence was paradoxically considered foundational to the nation's moral health. It was believed that a virtuous home produced virtuous citizens, and thus the woman, as its primary custodian, held immense, albeit indirect, power. Her duties were extensive: managing servants, educating children, especially daughters, in domestic arts and moral instruction, overseeing household finances, often with a strict budget, and ensuring the smooth running of daily life. For a middle-class woman, idleness was not an option. Domesticity was a full-time, demanding occupation, albeit one largely hidden from public view. The emphasis on purity, particularly for women, was paramount. A woman's reputation was her most valuable asset, and any stain upon it could lead to social ostracization. Premarital sexual activity, or even the mere suspicion of it, could ruin a woman's prospects for marriage and respectability. This double standard was stark, as similar transgressions by men were often overlooked or excused. This intense focus on female purity led to a culture of strict chaperonage, elaborate courtship rituals, and a pervasive silence around topics of sex and the body, particularly for women. It was a silence that, for many, bred ignorance and anxiety. Childhood, too, underwent a significant transformation during this era. While children in working-class families often toiled in factories or mines, middle and upper-class children were increasingly seen as innocent beings, requiring protection, education, and moral guidance. The concept of a distinct period of childhood, separate from adulthood, gained traction. Play was encouraged, but often with an underlying didactic purpose, teaching moral lessons or preparing children for their future roles. Education, for boys, focused on classical languages, mathematics, and science, preparing them for public life. For girls, it centered on accomplishments like music, drawing, and needlework, alongside moral and religious instruction, all designed to make them suitable wives and mothers. The nursery became a distinct and important space within the home, a realm of innocence and careful cultivation. Yet, beneath this seemingly placid surface of domestic bliss, tension simmered. For one, the ideal of the angel in the house was often unattainable, placing immense pressure on women to embody an impossible perfection. Many women found their intellectual and creative aspirations stifled by the narrow confines of their prescribed roles. The rise of women's colleges in the latter half of the century, such as Girton College at Cambridge in 1869 and Somerville College at Oxford in 1879, began to challenge this intellectual confinement, offering opportunities for higher education previously denied to women. However, these opportunities were still largely confined to a privileged few, and even then, often met with societal skepticism or outright opposition. Moreover, the rigid class structure of Victorian society meant that the domestic ideal was largely a middle and upper-class phenomenon. For working-class families, the realities of life were far harsher. Women often had to work outside the home, in factories, as domestic servants, or in sweatshops, simply to make ends meet. Their homes were often cramped, unsanitary, and lacked the comforts idealized by the middle class. The idea of a separate sphere for women was a luxury they could ill afford. This stark contrast highlights a key scholarly dispute. To what extent did the Victorian ideal truly reflect the lived experiences of the majority of the population, or was it primarily a construct of the dominant middle class, perpetuated through their control of media and cultural narratives? Historians still debate whether the pervasive image of the domestic ideal was a genuine reflection of widespread values or a prescriptive tool used to maintain social order and gender hierarchy. The cult of respectability extended beyond the confines of the home, permeating public life and social interactions. Appearance was everything. Proper dress, decorum, and adherence to elaborate rules of etiquette were crucial for maintaining one's social standing. Even subtle breaches of etiquette could be seen as indicators of moral laxity or a lack of breeding. Conversation was carefully navigated, with certain topics deemed inappropriate for polite company, especially in the presence of women. This emphasis on outward propriety often led to a culture of repression where emotions were carefully controlled and societal expectations often trumped individual desires. Philanthropy and charitable work also became an integral part of respectable Victorian life, particularly for middle and upper-class women. Confined to the domestic sphere and often with ample leisure time, thanks to the presence of servants, many women channeled their energies into social reform. They founded and supported charities, visited the poor, and advocated for various causes, from temperance to the abolition of child labor. This was often seen as an extension of their domestic role, nurturing and caring for society at large, much as they would their own families. Figures like Florence Nightingale, though she broke many traditional molds, was still seen through the lens of a ministering angel, extending the domestic virtues of care and compassion to the public sphere of healthcare. Despite the pervasive emphasis on morality and strict social codes, the Victorian era was also a period of immense social change and intellectual ferment. Darwin's theories challenged long-held religious beliefs, while burgeoning feminist movements began to question the restrictive gender roles. The rise of the new woman at the end of the century, a more independent and educated female figure, signaled a shift away from the rigid domestic ideal, though it would take many more decades for truly significant changes to occur. Perhaps these rigid structures, so meticulously built, were also the very forces that, through their inherent pressures and contradictions, laid the groundwork for their eventual, gradual dismantling. The whispers of change, though faint at first, began to echo through the drawing rooms and quiet nurseries, hinting at a future where the definition of respectability might be far broader and the confines of the home less absolute. As the industrial gears turned relentlessly, reshaping landscapes and lives, the human spirit, ever resilient, sought solace and expression beyond the factory walls. This era, often painted in shades of soot and steam, was also a vibrant tapestry of artistic and cultural endeavor, a profound search for meaning amidst the clamor of progress. It was a time when the anxieties of a rapidly changing world, the yearning for beauty, and the profound questions of existence found voice in literature, form in architecture, color on canvas, and melody in music. Literature, perhaps more than any other art form, became the mirror and the conscience of the age. The novel, in particular, blossomed, offering expansive canvases upon which to explore the intricate dance between individual lives and societal forces. Charles Dickens, with his keen eye for social injustice and his boundless empathy, populated his London with unforgettable characters: the exploited, the aspirational, the morally ambiguous. His serial publications, like Oliver Twist, 1837 to 1839, and Bleak House, 1852 to 1853, were devoured by a public eager to see their own struggles and triumphs reflected, often with a critical, yet ultimately hopeful, gaze. Dickens's ability to weave intricate plots with vivid descriptions of urban squalor and the resilience of the human spirit made him a titan of the literary world. His stories, often published in monthly installments, created a shared cultural experience, with families gathering around the latest chapter, discussing the fates of Pip or Miss Havisham as if they were personal acquaintances. Alongside Dickens, other literary giants wrestled with the era's complexities. George Eliot, the pen name of Mary Ann Evans, delved deep into psychological realism and moral philosophy. Her masterpiece, Middlemarch, 1871 to 1872, explored the lives of a provincial town, dissecting ambition, idealism, and the limitations placed upon women, all with a profound understanding of human nature. Her prose, rich and contemplative, invited readers to ponder the ethical dilemmas of everyday life, challenging the simplistic moralizing often found in earlier works. The Bronte sisters, isolated on the windswept moors of Yorkshire, crafted passionate and often dark tales that defied the conventional expectations of female authors. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, 1847, championed the independent spirit of its titular heroine, while Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, 1847, plunged into the wild, untamed passions of love and revenge, a stark contrast to the more restrained narratives of the time. These works, though sometimes met with shock for their frankness, resonated deeply with readers who felt the stirrings of a more complex inner life. Poetry, too, navigated the currents of the age. Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate for much of the era, gave voice to both national pride and personal grief. His long elegy, In Memoriam AHH, 1850, written after the death of his close friend Arthur Henry Hallam, grappled with faith, doubt, and the nature of existence in a world increasingly shaped by scientific discovery. Its lines, "Are God and nature then at strife, so loyal to the human heart?" echoed the profound questions many were asking as Darwin's theories began to circulate. Robert Browning, with his dramatic monologues, explored the psychological depths of his characters, often revealing their flaws and complexities through their own words, a technique that felt remarkably modern. And Christina Rossetti, in her hauntingly beautiful verses, often explored themes of love, loss, and spiritual longing, her words imbued with a delicate melancholy. Beyond the written word, architecture stood as a monumental testament to the era's aspirations and anxieties. The Gothic revival, in particular, swept across Britain a conscious rejection of the perceived coldness and industrial ugliness of the modern age. Architects like Augustus Pugin championed a return to medieval forms, believing that the Gothic style embodied moral and spiritual purity, a stark contrast to the perceived decadence of classical forms. The Houses of Parliament, rebuilt after a devastating fire in 1834 and completed over several decades, stand as the quintessential example of this movement. Designed by Charles Barry with significant input from Pugin, its intricate spires, stained glass, and ornate detailing were a deliberate attempt to connect the heart of British governance with a romanticized, idealized past. This architectural choice was not merely aesthetic. It was a statement about national identity, continuity, and a longing for a perceived golden age before the smokestacks rose. However, the Victorian architectural landscape was far from monolithic. While Gothic revival dominated public buildings and churches, The burgeoning middle class often favored a more eclectic mix for their homes, drawing inspiration from various historical styles, sometimes blending them in ways that later generations would find charmingly eccentric. The desire for comfort, privacy, and a clear distinction between public and private life shaped the domestic architecture, leading to the proliferation of bay windows, elaborate fireplaces, and distinct rooms for specific functions. The drawing room, the dining room, the study. These homes, often adorned with a profusion of decorative elements, reflected a desire for stability and respectability in a world that felt increasingly disorienting. Painting, too, underwent significant transformations. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, formed in 1848, was a radical artistic movement that sought to reject the academic conventions of their time, particularly the influence of Raphael, whom they believed had led art astray. Artists like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais, and William Holman Hunt returned to the vivid colors, meticulous detail, and moralistic themes of early Italian Renaissance art before Raphael. Their works, often depicting literary or mythological scenes, were imbued with intense symbolism and a profound sense of beauty, sometimes bordering on the melancholic. Millais's Ophelia, 1851 to 1852, with its breathtaking botanical accuracy and poignant depiction of a drowning woman, is a prime example of their commitment to truth to nature combined with emotional depth. Their art was a deliberate counterpoint to the industrial landscape, a retreat into a world of heightened emotion and idealized beauty, yet often tinged with the anxieties of mortality and fleeting youth. Beyond the Pre-Raphaelites, other artists captured the diverse facets of Victorian life. James McNeill Whistler, an American expatriate, brought a new sensibility to London's art scene, emphasizing mood and atmosphere over narrative detail, as seen in his evocative nocturnes of the Thames. His famous arrangement in gray and black No. 1, more commonly known as Whistler's Mother, 1871, transcended mere portraiture to become an iconic study of form and tone. The Royal Academy continued to hold sway, showcasing a wide range of styles, from grand historical paintings to domestic genre scenes that offered glimpses into the lives of ordinary people. The rise of photography, though initially viewed with suspicion by some artists, also began to influence painting, pushing artists to explore new ways of seeing and representing the world, rather than simply replicating it. Music, while perhaps less overtly revolutionary than other art forms, also reflected the era's tastes and values. The opera remained immensely popular, with Italian and French composers like Verdi and Gounod dominating the stages, their dramatic narratives and soaring melodies captivating audiences. However, British composers also began to emerge, often drawing on national themes and folk traditions. Arthur Sullivan, in collaboration with the librettist W.S. Gilbert, created a series of hugely successful comic operas, such as the Rites of Penzance, 1879, and the Mikado, 1885. These operettas, with their witty lyrics, memorable tunes, and gentle satire of Victorian society, provided light-hearted entertainment while subtly critiquing the absurdities of the age. Their popularity was immense, and their songs were hummed in homes across the country. The rise of the piano as a ubiquitous instrument in middle-class homes meant that parlor music flourished. Sheet music for popular songs, hymns, and simplified classical pieces was widely available, allowing families to create their own musical entertainment. This domestic musicality fostered a sense of community and provided an outlet for emotional expression in an era that often valued restraint. Public concerts also became more common, with orchestras and choral societies performing a mix of classical works and contemporary compositions. The Crystal Palace, after its relocation from the Great Exhibition site, became a significant venue for musical performances, hosting large-scale concerts and festivals that brought music to a broader public. The search for meaning in the Victorian era was not confined to grand artistic expressions. It permeated daily life and popular culture. The rise of museums, like the South Kensington Museum, later the Victoria and Albert Museum, provided access to art, science, and design for a wider public, reflecting a belief in the power of education and self-improvement. Public libraries, often funded by philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie, became beacons of knowledge, offering working-class individuals the opportunity to broaden their horizons. These institutions were seen as vital tools for moral and intellectual uplift, a way to civilize the masses and counter the perceived corrupting influences of urban life. However, historians still debate the true extent to which these cultural institutions genuinely democratized access to art and knowledge, or if they primarily served to reinforce existing social hierarchies and moral codes. While the intention was often noble, the practicalities of access, time, and prior education meant that engagement varied significantly across social strata. Nevertheless, the very existence of these public spaces marked a significant shift in how society viewed the role of culture and learning. Beyond formal institutions, the era saw the emergence of a vibrant, popular culture. Music halls, with their raucous entertainment, offered a different kind of escape, a world of comedy, song, and spectacle that appealed to the working classes. These venues, often seen as morally questionable by the more respectable elements of society, were nevertheless vital centers of community and entertainment, reflecting a different set of anxieties and aspirations. The penny dreadfuls, cheap serialized stories, often featuring sensational tales of crime, adventure, and the supernatural, provided thrilling escapism for those with limited means. Though scorned by the literary establishment, these publications were widely read and demonstrated a hunger for narrative and excitement that transcended social boundaries. The fascination with the supernatural, spiritualism, and the occult also found a curious place within Victorian culture, perhaps as a counterpoint to the relentless march of scientific rationalism. Seances, mediumship, and ghost stories became surprisingly popular, offering a glimpse into a world beyond the tangible, a comforting thought for those grappling with loss and the uncertainties of life and death. Figures like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, were deeply involved in spiritualism, believing it offered profound truths beyond scientific explanation. This embrace of the unseen, even by some of the most rational minds, highlights the era's complex relationship with faith, reason, and the unknown. Even the very act of collecting, whether it be butterflies, stamps, or curiosities from distant lands, became a widespread cultural phenomenon. These collections, often meticulously organized and displayed, reflected a desire for order, knowledge, and mastery over the vast, often overwhelming world. They were microcosms of the Victorian impulse to categorize, to understand, and to bring beauty and meaning into one's personal space. Perhaps these domestic museums, filled with the echoes of distant lands and forgotten crafts, whispered stories to the stars, connecting the individual to a grander narrative of human endeavor and discovery. In essence, the artistic and cultural expressions of the Victorian era were a profound dialogue with its own tumultuous times. They were a testament to the human need for beauty, for narrative, for meaning, even as the world outside transformed at an unprecedented pace. From the soaring spires of Gothic cathedrals to the intimate melodies of a parlor piano, from the social critiques of Dickens to the psychological depths of Eliot. The Victorians poured their anxieties, their aspirations, and their relentless search for truth into every brushstroke, every word, and every note. It was an era that, despite its outward rigidity, harbored a deep well of creativity, constantly seeking to understand itself and its place in a universe that felt both expanding and increasingly uncertain. The gentle hum of progress, a constant companion through the mid-Victorian years, extended its influence beyond the whirring machinery and the sprawling urban landscapes, reaching deep into the very heart of governance itself. The political landscape, once a rigid, almost static entity, began to ripple and shift, responding to the growing chorus of voices from outside the gilded halls of Westminster. The cry for reform, though not new, gained an undeniable urgency, fueled by the burgeoning middle class, the organized labor movements, and the sheer demographic weight of a rapidly expanding populace. Before the transformative acts of the mid-19th century, the British electoral system was a curious, often anachronistic patchwork. Suffrage, the right to vote, was severely restricted, largely tied to property ownership and income. In many constituencies, a handful of wealthy landowners or prominent citizens held sway, their votes often determining the outcome. The infamous rotten boroughs, remnants of a bygone era, continued to exist, places where a mere handful of residents, or sometimes none at all, could elect a member of parliament, while booming industrial towns, with tens of thousands of inhabitants, had no representation whatsoever. This glaring imbalance, a relic of the pre-industrial age, became increasingly untenable as the nation modernized. The first significant tremor in this established order came with the Great Reform Act of 1832, a pivotal moment that, while preceding Victoria's reign by 5 years, laid the groundwork for the changes to come. It abolished many of the rotten boroughs, redistributed seats to more populous industrial centers, and expanded the franchise, albeit modestly, to include a greater portion of the middle class. Yet even after 1832, the vast majority of working-class men, and all women, remained disenfranchised. The parliamentary system, though nudged towards modernity, still largely reflected the interests of the landed gentry and the burgeoning industrial elite. As Victoria's reign matured, the pressure for further reform became irresistible. The Chartist movement, though it had largely faded by the 1850s, had planted seeds of popular demand for universal male suffrage, annual parliaments, and other democratic reforms. Their petitions, though rejected, had demonstrated the widespread yearning for greater political inclusion. The economic prosperity of the mid-Victorian era, paradoxically, also contributed to the reform impulse. With more people finding employment and stability, there was a growing sense of civic responsibility and a desire for their voices to be heard in the national conversation. The stage was set for the Second Reform Act of 1867, a landmark piece of legislation that dramatically reshaped the electoral map and the very nature of British politics. This act, championed by the Conservative Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, was a calculated political gamble. Disraeli, a shrewd and charismatic leader, saw an opportunity to dish the Whigs, the Liberal Party's predecessors, by embracing reform, believing it would ultimately benefit his own party. Yet the path to its passage was anything but smooth, marked by intense parliamentary debate, public demonstrations, and political maneuvering. The 1867 Act extended the franchise to include many working-class men in urban areas, effectively doubling the electorate. It granted the vote to male householders in boroughs, meaning that anyone who occupied a house, regardless of its value, could vote. along with lodgers who paid at least £10 a year in rent. While still far from universal male suffrage, it was a profound shift, bringing millions of new voters into the political fold. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The traditional political parties, once largely reliant on the support of a narrower, more predictable electorate, now had to appeal to a much broader and more diverse constituency. This led to the development. The idea of more sophisticated party organizations, mass rallies, and a greater emphasis on public opinion. The expansion of suffrage also spurred a quiet revolution in the culture of politics. Public speeches became more common, newspapers played an even greater role in shaping opinion, and politicians began to cultivate a more direct relationship with their constituents. The idea of the common man having a say in the affairs of the nation, once a radical notion, began to take root. Historians still debate whether Disraeli's motivations were purely opportunistic or if he genuinely believed in extending democratic rights. Some argue he was a cynical pragmatist, while others credit him with a forward-thinking vision for a more inclusive society. Regardless of his personal convictions, the act he championed irrevocably altered the course of British democracy. The Third Reform Act of 1884, enacted under the Liberal Prime Minister William Gladstone, continued this trajectory, further extending the franchise to include male householders in rural areas, bringing the electoral system closer to universal male suffrage, though still excluding women. This act also standardized the borough and county franchises, making the system more uniform across the country. By the end of Victoria's reign, the vast majority of adult men in Britain had the right to vote, a remarkable transformation from the restricted electorate of the early 19th century. These reforms, however, were not simply about who could vote. They also fundamentally altered the dynamics of parliamentary power. The House of Commons, once dominated by aristocratic landowners, gradually became more representative of the broader population. The rise of organized political parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, became more pronounced, with clear policy platforms and national organizations. The role of the Prime Minister, as the leader of the majority party in the Commons, grew in prominence, becoming the central figure in the executive branch. The House of Lords, the unelected upper chamber of Parliament, also saw its power subtly diminish. While it retained the ability to reject legislation passed by the Commons, its moral authority to do so waned, as the Commons became increasingly seen as the true voice of the people. This evolving dynamic laid the groundwork for future clashes between the two houses, culminating in the early 20th century with acts that further curtailed the Lords' power. Beyond the grand acts of reform, a myriad of other legislative changes and shifting norms contributed to the evolving political landscape. The professionalization of the civil service, for example, aimed to reduce patronage and ensure that government positions were filled based on merit rather than connections. This seemingly minor reform had a profound impact, creating a more efficient and less corrupt bureaucracy, capable of managing the complexities of a growing empire and an increasingly industrialized nation. The rise of public opinion as a force in politics was another significant development. The proliferation of newspapers, the advent of cheap printing, and the growth of literacy meant that political debates were no longer confined to the elite. Ordinary citizens, armed with information and a newfound voice at the ballot box, began to exert greater influence. Political campaigns became more sophisticated, utilizing posters, pamphlets, and public meetings to sway voters. The very language of politics adapted, becoming more accessible and less arcane. Yet, even with these sweeping changes, the political system remained imperfect. Women, despite their active participation in social reform movements and public life, were still denied the vote, a struggle that would continue well into the next century. The complexities of the Irish question, the growing demands for home rule, and the burgeoning imperial responsibilities also presented immense challenges to the evolving parliamentary. The shifting power dynamics within Parliament were not always smooth or harmonious. The fierce rivalries between towering figures like Gladstone and Disraeli, often dubbed the Grand Old Man and the Sphinx, respectively, defined much of the political discourse of the latter half of the century. Their debates, often eloquent and passionate, captivated the nation, reflecting differing philosophies on everything from foreign policy to social welfare. Gladstone, a devout liberal, championed moral righteousness and fiscal prudence, while Disraeli, the conservative, emphasized imperial expansion and social reform from above. Their political jousting, played out in the hallowed halls of Westminster and amplified by the press, became a defining feature of the era. One lesser-known detail about this period of reform is the surprising role of working-class self-education. Mechanics' institutes and mutual improvement societies, often established by working people themselves, provided opportunities for learning about history, economics, and political theory. These informal educational networks fostered a generation of politically aware citizens who could articulate their demands for reform with clarity and conviction, challenging the notion that the working class was unsuited for the responsibilities of suffrage. Perhaps these quiet study groups, meeting in rented rooms or back parlors, were as instrumental in shaping the future of British democracy as the grand debates in Parliament. The expansion of the electorate also led to a greater focus on social legislation. With more working-class voters, politicians began to pay more attention to issues such as public health, education, and factory conditions. The latter half of the Victorian era saw a raft of legislation aimed at improving the lives of ordinary people. From acts regulating working hours and safety in factories to measures improving sanitation and housing in urban areas, this shift demonstrated that political power, when broadened, could indeed translate into tangible improvements in daily life for millions. The Victorian era, therefore, was not merely a period of industrial might and imperial expansion. It was also a crucible of political transformation. The gradual, often contentious, expansion of suffrage and the evolving dynamics of parliamentary power laid the foundations for the modern democratic state. It was a journey from a system dominated by a privileged few to one that, by the close of the century, began to genuinely reflect the will of a much wider segment of society, a testament to the enduring power of reform and the persistent, gentle hum of progress. A hum of industry, ever present in the great cities of Europe, began to resonate with a new, more insistent beat as the 19th century drew to a close. The age of exploration, once a pursuit of discovery and trade, transformed into an urgent, almost feverish quest for dominion. The vast, largely unmapped interior of Africa, often referred to as the Dark Continent by European powers, now gleamed with the promise of untold riches, minerals, fertile lands, and new markets for the burgeoning factories. This was the era of the Scramble for Africa, a period of unprecedented imperial expansion that would irrevocably alter the global landscape. By the 1870s, European presence in Africa was largely confined to coastal trading posts and a few established colonies. France held sway in parts of North Africa and along the West African coast, while Britain had significant interests in the Cape Colony and scattered settlements. Portugal maintained historical claims, and even tiny Belgium, under the ambitious King Leopold II, harbored grand designs. The catalyst for the intensified scramble was multifaceted. Economic depression in Europe in the 1870s spurred a search for new resources and markets. Technological advancements, particularly in medicine with quinine combating malaria and in weaponry with rapid-firing rifles, made deeper penetration into the continent more feasible. And underlying it all was a potent cocktail of national prestige, a sense of civilizing mission, and often thinly veiled racism. One of the most pivotal moments, often cited as the official start of the Scramble, was the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. Convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, this gathering of European powers, notably without a single African representative, sought to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa. The stated aim was to prevent conflict among the European nations themselves, but the outcome was a formalized partition of the continent. The principle of effective occupation was established, meaning that a European power had to demonstrate actual control over a territory. Through treaties with local rulers, often coerced or misunderstood, military presence, or administrative structures, to legitimize its claim. This led to a frantic rush to establish outposts and sign agreements, often with little regard for existing African political structures, ethnic boundaries, or traditional land rights. Consider the Congo Basin, a vast, resource-rich area that became the personal domain of King Leopold II of Belgium. Through a series of cunning maneuvers and the establishment of the International Association of the Congo, Leopold managed to convince the other European powers at Berlin to recognize his claim over this immense territory, which was 76 times the size of Belgium. He rebranded it as the Congo Free State, ostensibly a humanitarian venture, but in reality, it became a brutal exploitative regime focused on extracting rubber and ivory. The atrocities committed under Leopold's rule, including forced labor, mutilation, and mass killings, would later become a shocking testament to the darker side of imperial ambition, though they remained largely hidden from the European public for many years. Historians still debate the precise number of deaths attributable to Leopold's regime, with estimates ranging from 1 million to 15 million, highlighting the difficulty of quantifying human suffering in such a chaotic and poorly documented period. Meanwhile, Britain, already a global superpower, saw its empire expand exponentially. Driven by figures like Cecil Rhodes, whose vision was a Cape to Cairo railway connecting British possessions across the length of Africa, vast swaths of land were annexed. The discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in 1867 and gold in the Witwatersrand in 1886 fueled an insatiable appetite for mineral wealth, leading to increased conflict with the Boer settlers of Dutch descent in South Africa, culminating in the Anglo-Boer Wars at the turn of the century. These wars, particularly the Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, were surprisingly difficult for the British, revealing the challenges of maintaining control over such far-flung territories, and leading to the infamous use of concentration camps by the British to intern Boer civilians, a grim precursor to later 20th century horrors. France, not to be outdone, consolidated its control over much of West and North Africa, establishing vast colonial empires in territories like French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa. Germany, a relatively late comer to the imperial game, nevertheless acquired significant territories in East Africa, Tanganyika, Southwest Africa, Namibia, Cameroon, and Togo, often through brutal suppression of local resistance. Italy, aspiring to great power status, attempted to conquer Ethiopia in the First Italo-Ethiopian War, 1895 to 1896, but suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Adwa, making Ethiopia one of the few African nations to successfully resist European colonization during this period. This lesser-known victory, achieved by Emperor Menelik II's modernized army, stood as a beacon of African resilience against overwhelming odds. The impact of this rapid partition on Africa was profound and devastating. Traditional political systems were dismantled, economic structures were reoriented towards serving European industrial needs, and arbitrary borders drawn on European maps often cut across existing ethnic and linguistic lines, sowing the seeds for future conflicts. The introduction of cash crops, forced labor, and taxation fundamentally altered African societies, often leading to widespread poverty and dependence. Indigenous cultures were suppressed, and European education and legal systems were imposed, further eroding traditional ways of life. Beyond Africa, the imperial zenith manifested in other parts of the world. Britain tightened its grip on India, the jewel in the crown, through direct rule following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the construction of the Suez Canal in 1869, though an Anglo-French venture significantly shortened the sea route to India, making the region even more strategically vital for Britain. In Southeast Asia, France expanded its control over Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, while the Netherlands maintained its vast East Indies empire, Indonesia. The United States, though a relatively new player on the imperial stage, acquired territories like the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam after the Spanish-American War of 1898, marking its emergence as a global power. Even Japan, rapidly modernizing after the Meiji Restoration, began its own imperial ventures, challenging China and later Russia for regional dominance. The motivations behind this global imperial surge were complex and often intertwined. Economic determinism suggests that the need for raw materials, new markets, and investment opportunities drove expansion. Strategic imperatives, such as securing trade routes or establishing naval bases, also played a significant role. The civilizing mission, a paternalistic belief that European nations had a duty to bring Christianity, Western education, and progress to supposedly backward peoples, provided a moral justification for often brutal exploitation. Social Darwinism, a misapplication of Darwinian evolutionary theory to human societies, further fueled imperial ambitions by suggesting that certain races or nations were inherently superior and destined to dominate others. The sheer scale of the British Empire at its peak was astounding. By the early 20th century, it encompassed nearly a quarter of the world's land area and governed a quarter of its population. The sun, it was famously said, never set on the British Empire. This global reach was maintained through a powerful navy, sophisticated administrative structures, and a network of loyal local elites. Yet, beneath the veneer of imperial grandeur, tensions simmered. Resistance movements, though often brutally suppressed, never truly died out. The seeds of nationalism were being sown in colonized lands, nurtured by the very ideas of self-determination and liberty that European powers often espoused at home but denied abroad. Perhaps these vast colonial empires, stretching across continents and oceans, whispered stories of both immense power and profound injustice to the stars. The immense wealth extracted from colonies fueled industrial growth in Europe, contributing to an unprecedented period of prosperity for the imperial powers. Yet, this prosperity came at an enormous human cost. The legacy of arbitrary borders, economic exploitation, and racial hierarchies would continue to shape the political and social landscape of the post-colonial world for decades, even centuries to come. As the 20th century dawned, the world was largely carved up among a handful of powerful nations. The map of the globe was a patchwork of colonial possessions, each line a testament to European ambition and power. This imperial zenith, however, also brought with it heightened international rivalries. The scramble for colonies, particularly in Africa, led to numerous diplomatic crises and near conflicts among the European powers, contributing to an atmosphere of intense competition and suspicion. The Fashoda Incident of 1898, where British and French forces confronted each other in a remote Sudanese outpost, brought the two nations to the brink of war over African territory. Though resolved peacefully, it underscored the precarious nature of imperial expansion. This era of intense competition and the vast military machines required to maintain global empires would ultimately contribute to the outbreak of the First World War. The imperial powers had created a global system of interconnectedness, but it was a system built on dominance and exploitation rather than cooperation. The resources, manpower, and strategic locations provided by colonies would become crucial assets during the global conflicts that lay ahead. The Victorian Era, which began with industrial innovation and social reform, concluded with an unprecedented expansion of global power, leaving a complex and often contradictory legacy that continues to resonate in the world today. The echoes of the scramble for Africa, the cries from the Congo, and the quiet dignity of those who resisted all form part of this intricate historical tapestry, reminding us that progress and power often walk hand in hand with profound human consequences. As the gaslights flickered across the cobbled streets of London, casting long, dancing shadows, a subtle shift began to permeate the very air of the Victorian age. The grand, unwavering confidence that had characterized much of the century started to wane, replaced by a creeping sense of unease, a murmur of doubt that grew louder with each passing year. The relentless march of progress, once celebrated without question, now seemed to carry a darker undertone, hinting at a world perhaps too complex, too fast, too modern. This was the fin de siècle, the end of the century, a period often characterized by a rich tapestry of cultural and intellectual shifts, marked by both a sense of decline and the vibrant emergence of new, often rebellious artistic and social movements. The certainties of the past, built upon a foundation of fervent faith and industrial might, began to crumble under the weight of new discoveries and philosophical introspection. Charles Darwin's theories, though published decades earlier, continued to reverberate, challenging humanity's unique place in the universe and stirring profound theological debates. If life evolved through natural selection, what then of divine creation? This scientific upheaval was compounded by the burgeoning field of psychology, particularly the early work of figures like Sigmund Freud, whose theories, though still nascent, hinted at hidden depths within the human mind, irrational urges, and subconscious desires that defied Victorian notions of rational control and moral rectitude. The very idea of the self, once seen as a coherent and understandable entity, began to fragment, revealing layers of complexity and contradiction. This intellectual ferment found its mirror in the arts. The once dominant Romanticism, with its emphasis on emotion and the sublime, and the later realism, which sought to depict life as it truly was, began to give way to new forms of expression. Aestheticism, a movement championing art for art's sake, emerged as a direct challenge to the utilitarian and moralistic principles that had long guided Victorian art. Figures like Oscar Wilde, with his flamboyant wit and provocative plays such as The Importance of Being Earnest, first performed in 1895, embodied this new ethos. He famously declared, "All art is quite useless," a statement that scandalized many, but delighted those who sought beauty and pleasure for their own sake, rather than for moral instruction or social commentary. This embrace of beauty, sometimes bordering on decadence, was a deliberate rejection of the perceived dullness and hypocrisy of mainstream Victorian society. The flowing lines of Art Nouveau, with its organic, natural forms, also began to appear in architecture, illustration, and decorative arts, moving away from the heavy, ornate styles of earlier decades. Yet beneath this artistic flourish lay a deeper current of anxiety. The sheer scale of the British Empire, while a source of immense pride, also began to foster a subtle fear of overextension, of a world growing too vast to control. The Boer Wars in South Africa, particularly the Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, revealed the brutal realities of imperial expansion and the limitations of British military might, shattering the illusion of effortless global dominance. These conflicts, far from being glorious victories, were long, costly, and deeply divisive at home, leading to questions about the morality and sustainability of empire. The rise of other global powers, notably Germany and the United States, also contributed to a sense that Britain's unchallenged supremacy might be drawing to a close. Socially, the fin de siècle was a period of increasing tension and accelerating change. The rigid class structures, though still firmly in place, faced growing challenges. Labor movements gained strength, advocating for better working conditions, fair wages, and political representation. The rise of socialism, inspired by thinkers like Karl Marx, offered a radical alternative to the capitalist system that had defined the industrial age. Strikes became more frequent, signaling a growing discontent among the working classes who, despite the nation's wealth, often lived in poverty and squalor. The condition of England question, a recurring concern throughout the century, persisted, with reformers and philanthropists highlighting the vast disparities between the wealthy elite and the struggling masses. Perhaps one of the most profound shifts was the evolving role of women. The new woman emerged as a prominent, often controversial figure. These women, more educated and independent than previous generations, challenged traditional gender roles and sought greater autonomy. They rode bicycles, pursued higher education, entered professions previously closed to them, and most significantly, began to agitate for the right to vote. The suffragette movement, though it would reach its peak in the early 20th century, had its roots firmly in this period, with women like Millicent Fawcett leading peaceful campaigns for suffrage. Their demands for equality chipped away at the patriarchal foundations of Victorian society, causing considerable alarm among those who believed a woman's place was solely in the home. The cities themselves, once symbols of progress, began to be viewed with a more critical eye. While they offered opportunities, they also bred anonymity, crime, and social alienation. The dense fog that often enveloped London, a byproduct of coal fires, became a metaphor for the moral murkiness and hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface of polite society. Detective fiction, pioneered by Arthur Conan Doyle with his creation of Sherlock Holmes in 1887, captured this fascination with the city's underbelly, its mysteries, and the dark corners of the human psyche. These stories offered a thrilling yet comforting narrative of order restored, even as the real world felt increasingly chaotic. Historians still debate the precise nature and extent of this decadence, often associated with the fin de siècle. Was it a genuine societal decline, a moral decay, or simply a period of intense self-reflection and artistic experimentation? Some argue that the term decadence was largely a pejorative, used by those who clung to older values, a way to dismiss new ideas and lifestyles they found unsettling. Others see it as a legitimate expression of a deep-seated weariness with the perceived hypocrisy and rigidity of Victorian morality, a yearning for authenticity and uninhibited expression, even if it led to excess. The widespread use of drugs like opium and cocaine, though not new, seemed to become more openly associated with bohemian circles, further fueling the perception of a society teetering on the edge. This era also saw a renewed interest in the occult, spiritualism, and the supernatural. As traditional religious faith wavered for some, a void emerged, which many sought to fill with alternative belief systems. Seances, mediumship, and secret societies gained popularity, reflecting a desire to connect with something beyond the material world, to find meaning in an increasingly secular and scientific age. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882, even sought to scientifically investigate phenomena like telepathy and apparitions, blurring the lines between science and the mystical. The sense of an ending, of one era giving way to another, was palpable. The long reign of Queen Victoria, which had provided a constant, stable presence for over 6 decades, was drawing to a close. Her death in 1901 marked not just the end of a monarch's life, but the symbolic end of an age. The world that emerged from the Victorian fin de siècle was one poised on the brink of unprecedented change, a world grappling with the implications of industrialization, urbanization, scientific discovery, and evolving social structures. The anxieties and innovations of these final decades laid the groundwork for the upheavals of the 20th century, particularly the world wars and the dramatic shifts in global power. Looking back, the fin de siècle was not merely a period of decline, but a vibrant, complex, and often contradictory era. It was a time when the seeds of modernism were sown, when the rigid boundaries of Victorian society began to crack, allowing new ideas, new voices, and new forms of beauty to emerge. It was a moment of profound introspection, where the very foundations of belief, morality, and identity were questioned, paving the way for a future that would be dramatically different from the century that preceded it. The gaslights may have dimmed, but the intellectual and artistic fires ignited in these closing years would burn brightly, illuminating the path into a new, uncertain, but undeniably exciting age. As the final years of the 19th century began to unfold, a subtle shift in the air became perceptible, a quiet turning of the tide that even the most steadfast Victorians could sense. Queen Victoria, now an iconic figure of stability and endurance, entered her twilight years, her reign extending far beyond that of any previous British monarch. The Diamond Jubilee of 1897 had been a moment of unparalleled national pride, a grand spectacle that showcased the immense power and reach of the British Empire. Crowds thronged the streets of London, cheering for their aged sovereign, a symbol of an era that seemed immutable. Yet beneath the surface of this glittering display, new currents were beginning to stir, currents that would ultimately reshape the world she had known. The industrial might that had fueled Britain's rise was facing increasing competition. Nations like Germany and the United States, having industrialized later, were adopting newer technologies and more efficient production methods. Britain, with its vast established infrastructure, sometimes found itself slower to adapt. While the British Empire still spanned the globe, its economic dominance was gradually being challenged. The Boer Wars in South Africa, 1899 to 1902, served as a stark, if often downplayed, indicator of the shifting dynamics. What was initially expected to be a swift victory against the Dutch-descended settlers turned into a protracted and costly conflict, revealing logistical challenges and military vulnerabilities that surprised many. The use of concentration camps by the British to intern Boer civilians, though not on the scale or with the deliberate genocidal intent of later atrocities, sparked international condemnation and a growing unease within Britain itself about the moral implications of imperial expansion. This conflict, unfolding at the very end of Victoria's reign, cast a shadow over the triumphalism of the Jubilee just a few years prior. Socially, the rigid class structures that had characterized much of the Victorian era began to show signs of strain. The rise of organized labor, though often met with fierce resistance, gained momentum. Trade unions, once small and fragmented, grew in size and influence, advocating for better working conditions, fairer wages, and increased political representation for the working class. The Fabian Society, founded in 1884, represented a more intellectual, gradualist approach to socialism, advocating for social reform through democratic means rather than revolutionary upheaval. These movements, alongside the persistent efforts of suffragists like Millicent Fawcett, who championed women's right to vote through peaceful protest and parliamentary lobbying, signaled a growing demand for a more inclusive and equitable society. The Victorian ideal of individual self-reliance, while still strong, was being tempered by a nascent understanding of collective responsibility and social welfare. In the realm of science and thought, the certainties of the mid-Victorian period were giving way to new, often unsettling discoveries. Albert Einstein's work on relativity, though fully developed in the early 20th century, had its conceptual roots in the late Victorian scientific landscape, challenging Newtonian physics and the very notion of absolute time and space. Sigmund Freud's theories of the unconscious mind, beginning to take shape in the 1890s, introduced the revolutionary idea that human behavior was driven by hidden desires and repressed memories, fundamentally altering the understanding of self and consciousness. These intellectual currents, alongside the ongoing impact of Darwinian evolution, chipped away at traditional religious and philosophical frameworks, leading to a sense of intellectual ferment and, for some, a profound disquiet. The world, once seen as a knowable, ordered machine, was revealing itself to be far more complex and mysterious. Culturally, the late Victorian period saw a burgeoning of new artistic movements that consciously departed from the realism and moralizing tone of earlier Victorian art. The aesthetic movement, with its emphasis on art for art's sake and its embrace of beauty over utility or moral instruction, gained prominence. Figures like Oscar Wilde, with his wit and flamboyant lifestyle, embodied this shift, challenging Victorian sensibilities and often courting scandal. The rise of symbolism in literature and art, particularly in France, but influencing British artists, moved away from direct representation towards evocative imagery and subjective experience. These movements, though perhaps only appreciated by a select few at the time, laid the groundwork for the radical artistic transformations of the early 20th century. The very landscape of British life was changing too. While London remained the heart of the empire, its sheer size and complexity presented new challenges. The growth of suburban areas, facilitated by improved public transport, began to alter patterns of daily life, creating a new kind of commuter culture. The telephone, though still a luxury, was slowly becoming more common, hinting at a future of instant communication that would further shrink distances. The motor car, in its nascent stages, was a curiosity rather than a common sight, yet its potential to transform travel and urban planning was dimly perceived. These technological advancements, seemingly small in their individual impact, collectively contributed to a sense of accelerating change, a feeling that the world was moving faster than ever before. Queen Victoria's death in January 1901 marked not just the end of a reign, but the symbolic close of an epoch. Her passing, after 63 years on the throne, plunged the nation into mourning, yet it also ushered in a new era. Her son, Edward VII, ascended to the throne, bringing with him a more relaxed and cosmopolitan style that contrasted sharply with his mother's austere image. The Edwardian era, though brief, would be characterized by a growing sense of social liberalization and a continued, though increasingly challenged, imperial confidence. The legacy of the Victorian age was multifaceted and enduring. It left behind a vast empire, a complex industrial economy, and a society grappling with the profound changes wrought by rapid technological and intellectual advancement. The era had witnessed the birth of modern Britain, transforming it from an agrarian society into an urbanized, industrialized global power. It had grappled with questions of poverty, public health, education, and social justice, laying the foundations for many of the welfare reforms that would come in the 20th century. Yet, it also bequeathed a world teetering on the brink of unprecedented global conflict, a world where the certainties of the 19th century were dissolving under the weight of new ideas, new technologies, and new geopolitical realities. The forces that would eventually lead to the First World War, imperial rivalries, an arms race, and a complex web of alliances were already gathering momentum in the final years of Victoria's reign. Though their full destructive potential was not yet fully understood, the Victorian age, for all its stability and progress, had also sown the seeds of its own dissolution, paving the way for a new century that would be defined by both remarkable innovation and unimaginable upheaval. Historians still debate whether the seeds of the modern welfare state were more firmly planted by late Victorian social reformers or by the pressures of the ensuing world wars. The transition was not a sudden break, but a gradual, almost imperceptible, shift in the societal currents, much like the slow turning of the earth itself, bringing forth a new dawn from the long twilight.